Hello, my name's Ellen and I'm presenting today on the pre-service teachers' influences, beliefs and barriers to implementing teaching games for understanding in England. I'd like to thank my PhD supervisors, Stephen Anderson, Sandra Leyland and Jonathan Ling. So this is phase 3 of my PhD project. If you want to find out about phase 2 and a little bit about phase 1, they can be seen in my other 40th anniversary conference presentation. The main part of my PhD project was in order to look at in-service PE teachers and their barriers to TGfU. Within phase 1 and phase 2, looking at them in terms of occupational socialisation theory and an implementation in schools using a CPD programme and then practising it. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the schools in the UK then closed, changed onto online teaching, etc., which made it very difficult for my project to continue. Therefore, I had to find a different avenue of research. This included looking at pre-service teachers in the UK. So research with pre-service teachers implementing TGfU has been very extensive globally. However, there's limited current studies in the UK which are underpinned by occupational socialisation theory. Therefore, this was the avenue that I chose to expand upon my PhD project and continue down. So the underpinning theory of my project is occupational socialisation theory. This provides a framework regarding the possible influences on why teachers teach the way they do. Occupational socialisation theory has 5 assumptions. Assumption 1, socialisation of PE teachers is a lifelong process. Number 2, practices within PE are institutionalised, i.e. schools try to control behaviour and attitudes which influences teachers and the way they teach. Number 3, socialisation is problematic rather than automatic, where institutions attempt social control, however, teachers can also attempt to transform the institution. Number 4, socialisation process of teachers consists of 3 kinds or phases of socialisation that can be concurrent. These are acculturation, professional socialisation, and organisational socialisation. Assumption number 5 is the judgments regarding what is effective is dependent upon the situation and the person making them. Overall, this theory then allows us to look at, using these experiences, we can see how teachers are influenced to be how they teach, what got them to being a teacher, and their use of games-based approaches or TGfU. So the aim of my study was to examine pre-service teachers' influences, beliefs with regard to implementing TGfU in PE. Objective 1, to identify the influences that underpin pre-service teachers' acculturation, professional socialisation and organisational socialisation. So using those 3 phases of assumption 4. Objective 2 was to determine pre-service teachers' barriers and facilitators to implementing TGfU. So what happened was the pre-service teachers were involved in a semi-structured interview lasting 30 to 45 minutes. This was conducted between May and August of 2021. At the start of the interview, all participants were shown what is the TGfU model and a brief summary to allow them to ask any questions to assure that they understand what the approach is. 10 pre-service teachers in North East England took part, which included 4 males and 6 females aged between 21 and 36. All had experience teaching PE in primary schools, and 8 of them had experience teaching in secondary schools. 9 out of the 10 had prior knowledge of TGfU before conducting the interview. All data was analysed using thematic analysis. The findings from my occupational socialisation theory included acculturation, which is the childhood experiences. This included family influences, experiences of pupil, and early work experiences. Family was seen as a very important factor in the continuation and start of getting involved in sport for the participants. It included transporting and supporting the participants in their practices and matches, buying sports kits and equipment, and in many cases a shared enjoyment between family members. 9 out of 10 of the participants discussed which family members were pivotal in their uptake and continuation of sport. This included parents, siblings, and grandparents. Experience as a pupil at school was very positive, particularly in primary and secondary school. It was more notable in secondary schools due to being able to remember more details about what happened within their PE lessons. The PE teacher was a role model for many of the participants and exhibited characteristics or attitudes that the participants found favourable, for example, being quite laid back, approachable, humorous, and often that interpersonal relationship between the PE teacher and the participant inspired them to become a PE teacher themselves. Early work experiences was a key finding within this research. Prior to enrolment on the teacher education courses, all of the participants had work experience in teaching or coaching contexts. The pre-service teachers spoke positively about their work experiences, which they often started during their childhood and in most cases continue to the present day whilst enrolled on a teacher education course. In the UK, there is a greater need for early work experiences. This is particularly important for enrolment at university. This can lead to a greater variability of subjective warrants. Lawson in 1975 introduced the term subjective warrant. It describes the perceptions of the requirements of teacher education and the role of a PE teacher formed during the apprenticeship of observation. The subjective warrant includes a self-evaluation of an individual's ability to meet the requirements of a PE teacher and form conclusions based upon their perception of what is a successful PE teacher. Therefore, these early work experiences could impact their beliefs in later professional socialisation, so time at university, or organisational socialisation on the job. Professional socialisation was divided into university education and university placements. Whilst inquiring about their university experiences, the pre-service teachers recalled their theory and practical-based lectures. Although they spoke very positively about both of them, they had limited recollection of theoretical sessions but could provide more detail about their practical lessons. They described being exposed to a broad curriculum of modules, but could only provide limited details, and within this they mentioned the spectrum of teaching styles, game-based approaches and holistic development being specifically mentioned on their course. These references were also often made during discussions of their practical experiences, demonstrating a reinforcement of the theory by applied exposure and reflection. Although their overall opinion of the course was positive, the pre-service teachers expressed dissatisfaction due to the mixed messages they received from one or two lecturers. They indicated that understanding the purpose of the teacher education course was to provide them to an exposure of different disciplines, outlooks, and teaching contexts. However, the theory and philosophy of other lecturers was not supported in this belief, as they often criticised students for not following their particular approach. This made it very difficult in terms of assessment for pupils at university, and therefore they had to follow the direct lecturer's approach in order to succeed and pass their course. The university placements were very positive, outlining two key areas of discussion: the number and type of placements. The pre-service teachers had varied experiences in a number of different placements, which totaled between about 2 and 9, all completing at least one placement in a primary school, the majority completing at least one placement within a secondary school, and a small number gaining experience within a special educational needs and disability school. The organisational socialisation phase was a very important factor for many of these PE teachers. The impact of the COVID-19 had a significant impact on school placements and teaching practices for all of the participants. Whilst their school placement prior to COVID-19 were usually described as very positive, the pandemic had a negative impact on the participants due to the restrictions given by the pandemic, for example, school closures, moving online teaching, etc. The pre-service teachers recounted issues such as being unable to help demonstrate a point, as this involved approaching the children too closely, difficulties with maintaining engagement for children, particularly from more deprived areas whilst being outside without coats or jumpers, limited activities as children could not touch a ball that had been handled by another person, and the thorough cleaning regime between touching different equipment, decreased fitness levels of the pupils when they returned, and reduced lesson time as a consequence of needing to clean changing rooms and equipment. All of this resulted to the participants changing their teaching practice to be technique-based approach. Within the placement school environments, the pre-service teachers formed relationships with three primary groups of people: their mentors, their colleagues, and the pupils. The participants were generally positive about their interactions with their mentors, feeling comfortable with voicing any concerns that they encountered and feeling supported whilst on placement. However, several of the participants noted there was a conflict between their mentor, specifically in terms of their teaching approach and being graded. The participants tried to adopt game-based approaches into their practice, but were often discouraged by their mentors and received poorer feedback in their teaching observations when implementing the approach. The pre-service teachers' relationships and interactions with their colleagues were very mixed. Some colleagues were supportive of the participants with their teaching practice and attempting TGfU. Others felt they had to conform to their colleagues' teaching practices, specifically the technique-based approach. And finally, the pre-service teachers described their relationship with the children as being very positive and the most influential factor in determining their teaching approach. Within the study, the teachers identified some key barriers to TGfU and its implementation in school. The first one, lack of time. This was during lessons, a lack of time in lessons, particularly during the pandemic, which caused them to resort to teaching through a technique-based approach with their belief of ensuring and demonstrating pupil progression. A lack of understanding, particularly in how to modify games to meet the developmentally appropriate needs of the children, and also feeling like they need to teach the basic movements or skills prior to TGfU. Furthermore, there was a lack of understanding in the practical application of the model, particularly the expectations of what the games-based PE lesson would look like. Teachers had a lack of knowledge, particularly of modifying their practices. This also included how to assess using a games-based approach and its integration within the school grading system. Teachers identified a loss of control. The fears centred on the perception that the pupils would not be displaying uniform behaviours and which they believed made the class uncontrollable. This often led to the technique-based approach being taught instead of a game-based approach. Several of the teachers experienced a lack of support and a detrimental effect on their teaching assessment from mentors when employing TGfU. A lack of support from colleagues as well, discouraging them using the approach. Reluctance to change. The pre-service teachers discussed the influences of their pupils on the teaching approach they employed. The pre-service teacher's choice was often made based on the judgments of the pupils, and they anticipated how the pupils would respond. The pre-service teachers stated that their belief in their in-service colleagues would also make similar evaluations and react accordingly. And finally, a lack of confidence using TGfU or games-based approach due to its unfamiliarity, particularly in applying it practically and reverting back to their previous teaching approach. The pre-service teachers identified 7 recommendations. This included early exposure to TGfU and games-based approaches, particularly in primary and secondary schools. Their experience as a pupil being able to see game-based approaches being used would understand that familiarity in later life as they're becoming a PE teacher. They also noted there needed to be an increase in PE in primary initial teacher training. Often in the UK this can be quite limited, so an increase in the amount of PE may make teachers feel more supported and being able to teach PE and TGfU in primary school settings. They specifically stated that games-based approaches needed to be introduced in initial teacher training. This has happened in quite a few institutions, but it needs to be continued across all and pushed within primary and secondary initial teacher training. All of the pre-service teachers noted that an early CPD, particularly at organisational socialisation level, to in-service teachers so that they can then support pre-service teachers. This leads on to the next recommendation, support from colleagues and mentors in schools. If they have experience of teaching through TGfU and games-based approaches, if they feel comfortable in assessing people with this, it'll make it more easier to bring in TGfU into schools and have that support between pre-service and in-service teachers. They also recommended PE specialists in primary schools. This kind of links nicely into the increasing PE in primary initial teacher training. Having specialists who are familiar with PE beyond the usual national curriculum subjects would be able to help and support in a reasonable manner, allowing TGfU and games-based approaches to be introduced. And finally, more resources in a centralised location and often at a reasonable price for both students as pre-service teachers and in-service teachers. Finally, we need to understand the ongoing socialisation influences of PE teachers and the barriers to TGfU, especially within the changing educational landscape in each country. The COVID-19 pandemic had a major impact on schools and wider society here in the UK and globally. This event requires us to further evaluate the influences on teacher socialisation as more pupils are coming through the system and through teacher education and in-service teachers and through the uptake of games-based approaches. Therefore, we need to increase our research aimed in these areas to see this impact upon practice. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to again thank Dr. Stephen Anderson, Dr. Sandra Leyland and Professor Jonathan Ling for their support in this project. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.